So the recording has started, so you can always go back and watch this at any point in time. And as a little bit of a recap from last week, where we talked about the three schools of educational psychology that have been historically on the books, starting back with behaviorism in the 1920s and moving forward, became a very, our most favorite way of teaching in the 1940s and the 1950s, and even into part of the 1960s. And then a group of educational psychologists got together and started the idea of, let's look at how people think. Let's look at how they develop knowledge. Let's look at how they accommodate new information or assimilate information into their old ideas. And out of this grew the school of cognitive psychology, which, again, if you were to ask people at Robert Morris and the School of Education, which of the three schools does Robert Morris tie most closely with, I think all the faculty would say the cognitive school. And that's probably the majority across the country. But in the 1970s and on into the end of the 20th century, a third group of educational psychologists and psychologists in general got together and started thinking about the humanistic side of teaching. You know, it's more than giving people a stimulus and a response. It's more than constructing knowledge into building blocks. We have to consider how students feel and how they are going to accept the knowledge that we're trying to teach them. And school is more than just teaching academic content. And boy, if that lesson hasn't been taught to us in the last couple of weeks, we'll probably, I'd be very surprised. Look at what happened when schools closed for the pandemic. We were worried about everything from childcare to school lunches to interacting with other students. Our seniors lost their commencement ceremony. Our grade school children lost their move up to the next, their promotions. And all of that is going to continue to have a profound effect on our schools for many years. And so last week, we talked about some of the fundamental principles of each of the three schools. And I promised you today that we would take it to the next level, that we would look at how we, as college faculty that deal with freshmen through doctoral students, still need an understanding of how we ourselves learn, which was probably the most important lesson that we tried to take away from last week, because how we learn oftentimes, if not always, impacts how we teach. And so we're going to use some of the techniques in classroom applications that we have been successful with, and try to offer that to our students. But the problem is, as we talked about last week, is that we have students at all three of these schools, learning styles that reflect all three of these schools. And so while probably 50% of our students will learn behaviorally in some subject matter areas, other students that we have in our classes, another 30% are going to learn cognitively, maybe even 40%. And the last group of 20 or 10 or 20% need to have that humanistic interaction with teachers. Now, those percentages are, based on research and reading, but they are not precise. Depending on what we teach, a communications faculty member, the structure of their students might be way more on the humanistic side. The nurses might be way more humanistic. The accountants might be way more behavioral. So we all have to think about all three of these schools. And for those of us that are teaching any core courses, any gen ed courses, we're going to have students from all sorts of disciplines, all of the disciplines. And so we have to think about these. And that's why we're here tonight, is for me to talk about with you a little bit of how we prepare our free service teachers, if you will, with some practical classroom applications of these three skills. Okay. In one of the courses I teach in Ed Psych that's going on right now, and by the second week of class, I ask my students, if I were to be the principal of your school, or I was the dean of your school, and I was to walk past your room with a class full of students that we'd all like to have again. Okay? If I were to walk past your classroom and I just stuck my head in and observed for 5 minutes, what would I see in your classroom? Would I see you, if you say you're a behavioral teacher, if you're a behavioral learner, what would I see? Okay. Because it would be something very different than if I stuck my head into another faculty member and they professed a cognitive learning or teaching style. And certainly it would be different if I walked into a humanistic class. Okay. What would I see? Well, that's what we're going to talk about today. And the reason we're doing that is so that we can create our lessons in the future with some visible thinking about what we're doing and why we're doing it. I had one of my students send me a paper today because we went over something we're going to go over early tonight called mastery learning. And she said, you know what? I've been doing that for my whole career. That's kind of how I teach. I just never knew what it was before. I never had a name I could give it. I never really understood the principles that made it successful. And more importantly, I didn't understand what I might have been doing to a student that didn't learn that way. So that's going to be our focus for tonight. And we're going to start off by looking at a concept that has been around for a long time. And it will help us in creating instructions. Okay. And so with your permission, I'm going to do a little bit of sharing now of my screen and we'll get started. As before with last week, if you have any questions that you'd like asked while we're talking, okay, or maybe a little bit later when we can wrap this up, feel free to use the chat room right here, okay, and you can ask your questions. I see Donald and Heather. Hi, Heather. They've already been talking. That's good. Feel free to ask questions there. I'll kind of keep one eye on the chat room and try to answer those as we get started. Okay. So I'm going to start tonight with a way of designing instruction. Okay. And this has been around for quite a while. So I'm actually going to make this a little bigger here so we can see it a little easier. Okay. And, if I were to ask you to create a lesson plan, all right, you got a new textbook, you got a new course that's coming up, how would you go about doing it? Okay. Most of us would probably start looking at the textbook. Maybe we would grab a couple of the chapters that we think are most important. The way textbooks are nowadays, being as good as they are, we can probably count on the publisher giving us a really good table of contents, maybe some learning objectives in each of the chapters, and so on. But that's kind of depending on somebody else to help us design a lesson. And Robert Morris faculty are often assigned course designs and course redesigns, aren't we? Let me give you a model that has been around for a long time on how you might want to approach this in the future. It's called the ADDIE model, and you can see it right here. The ADDIE model has been around, oh my gosh, probably since World War II. And it actually started in, or at least adopted by the...
Lawrence, can I stop you for just a second? I cannot see your screen. It's too small. There is a way that you can share only the screen for the application. So if you maximize, if you go to presentation mode, and then it becomes much bigger in our screens. Thank you.
Okay, hang on a second. Let me see what I can do here. So let me stop presenting for a second. And you're saying to create a window instead of...
Yeah. When you go to share,
yeah,
instead of sharing screen, you go to share application, and then it's going to select you which application you want to share. Then you select share PowerPoint. And in PowerPoint, you can click on presentation mode, and then it becomes really big.
Okay, well, I don't really... The only options I have in Hangout is to share my entire screen or to share a window.
Yeah, share a window, that
okay.
one. Then you should have the PowerPoint window as one of the selections.
All right, let me try this. Is that better?
You were still showing your camera. Let me see here. Showing. Yeah, I'm seeing your folder.
Let me try if I move that out of the way and bring this up.
Yeah, when you bring that up, your PowerPoint is going to open, and then you can share the window for the PowerPoint.
Well, I know I can do that in Collaborate Ultra, but I don't see how to do that here.
Well,
let me try one more thing here and see if this helps. How about that?
I'm still seeing your folder.
Okay, well, I don't want to waste any more
time.
I'll try one more thing here. And then I want to keep moving. So
okay. Yeah, that's perfect.
Is that better?
That's much better. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so we're going to talk about the ADDIE model here for just a second. There are several different design models. And if you wanted to look at some of these, you could Google Instructional System Design, ISD. Okay? And Instructional System Design is a very conscripted way of creating a lesson or designing instruction. The ADDIE model, like I was saying earlier, has been around since the 1950s, actually since World War II. And it was designed and adopted by the military to create instruction and training for all of the troops that were being drafted into World War II. And the ADDIE model gives you a 5-step process that you can think about when designing instruction. And I'll go through this very quickly, but I just want you to know that there is a process here that you can follow. to be successful in creating a lesson plan. So rather than just starting and saying, well, let's see how this works out, you can follow these steps. The first one is, and it's an acronym, ADDIE stands for Analysis, Design, Develop, Implement, and Evaluate. And if you follow this process, you can design or redesign any course that you have. And as you can see, the ADDIE model starts with an analysis, okay? An analysis of, why am I teaching this lesson? Why am I teaching this course? What am I going to need? And most importantly, who is taking the course? Okay? And so you might look at these kind of elements. For example, if I'm teaching a course for teachers, I'm going to have a different audience than if I'm teaching a gen ed course in psychology or accounting or whatever. Excuse me. So in the analysis phase, you start looking at things like the standards, the quality indicators and skills. What do I want my students to be able to do when they're done with this course? Okay. You can look at learning objectives. What specifically are the outcomes? Now here at Robert Morris, when we do our merit pay every year, which we just finished last week, we had to do a student outcome report. Yeah. And if you analyzed your course correctly as you started, if you thought about this up front, this should have been fairly easy to do, because you laid out the intended learning outcomes and what you expected your students to be able to do when they finished. And then you look at the student audience. Okay. Again, who are they? Are they first-term freshmen? Are they fourth-year seniors? Are they master students? Are they doctoral students? Who am I teaching? So that's the analysis part. Now, you might look at that and say, well, I know that. That's easy. But if you're actually asked to write these things down, sometimes you'll spend more time thinking about this than you might otherwise. Okay. Again, I noticed, especially with the gen ed courses that we have in the core, that a lot of our faculty forget that, yeah, I might be teaching a general psych course, but I don't have psychology students in my class. I've got them from all the four schools. I've got them all in there. Okay. So you start with an analysis phase. Then you go into the design phase, where you actually write your learning objectives. You figure out how you're going to deliver your lesson, what activities and exercises that you might want as part of the lesson. Okay. Very good time to start thinking about that up front. And that's really where we're going to center tonight. I'm going to show you some learning activities and exercises that you can use. After you design, then you begin to develop. You develop a prototype course with materials, and you pick books, and you look at videos, and you create pilot sessions, and maybe even you work with your other faculty colleagues to have them critique the course that you're creating. Once you've got the course developed, then you actually deliver it. Okay. And so most of us, even now that we're asked to put our courses online, we have taught this course many times face-to-face. Okay. And so we've had a chance to implement our courses. We've had a chance to look at how the students react to what we're doing. So implementation happens pretty far down the line of a design phase. And then the last thing is to evaluate. Okay, so let's look at some more of these things. Some of the design elements. What are the instructional strategies and the activities that you're going to look at? When you start to develop it, Where are you going to find your resources and materials? What sort of technologies are you going to use? How are you going to differentiate instruction? More about that later. How are you going to accommodate students that might, we got a full range of students at Robert Morris when it comes to GPA scores. A lot of times the admissions office will tell us, the grade point average for our incoming freshman class is 3.5. Well, we all take that, I think, with a little grain of salt, because we know that there are a lot of 4.0 students and there's a lot of 2.0 students, and we want them all. We want them all to come to Robert Morris, but we have to make some accommodations in those kinds of things. In the implementation phase, you have to think about classroom management and motivation, how you're going to present things in the classroom, okay? And then two other areas that we're going to talk about tonight. What do you do with what I call the early finishers, with the students that get it right away and they're ready to move on to something else, versus the other students that are going to need some additional time to satisfactorily meet your learning objectives, okay? And then the last element, as you might expect, is assessment. We do it all the time. We ask our students to give us online assessments. We ask them to give us feedback. We have our department heads and colleagues come in and do observations for us. That's all part of the evaluation process that we go through. We do our own faculty evaluations. We do our own merit pay evaluations. And the idea behind the ADDIE model then is that this is a cycle. Actually, if we were to look at other graphics of the ADDIE model, it pictures it as a circle, where as soon as you're done evaluating, then you're going to start with a new analysis, because you're finding out new things. You're finding out that, oh, my students are different than I thought, or the millennials are different than the X generation, or the master students have a broader experience level than our incoming undergrads. So this is a continuous model. And so I wanted you to think about that when you start to create your materials. Last week, we talked about this idea of a behavioral learning objective. And notice that these objectives have 4 key elements in them, okay? It has 4 elements. It has the audience. Well, we just talked about that, right? Okay. We talked about being able to analyze who our student audience is. It has a behavior. We talked about that. What is the actual learning objectives that we want to have in there? We talked about the condition, which is what you learned last week, is the things that were the resources, materials, the technology that we're giving the students. And then we talked about how good do we want them to be. And that was the going in position with tonight's session. To be able to understand that developing a lesson takes a lot of work, okay? And it is a process that we ought to continue to think about. So if I said last week that I'm a behaviorist and I want to teach behaviorally, then let me show you one of the best ways to do that, okay? It's with a feature called, or a paradigm called, the mastery learning model, okay? If you said you're a behaviorist, if you said you want to teach a lesson behaviorally, then here's a really good model that you can use. Very practical example. Mastery learning is defined as an approach to instruction in which students must master a lesson before proceeding to the next lesson. Remember last week we talked about, we used the word sequencing, okay? We used the word sequencing. So here you go. The mastery learning model has clear, specific, observable, demonstratable learning objectives. Okay? In other words, you're going to create your learning objectives with these 4 pieces in them. Okay. Once you do that, you're going to create a threshold of mastery. What does the student need to do, and how well does she need to do it? Okay. So that's up to you. In your learning objective, I'm going to give my students a map of the United States. I want them to match the states with capitals, and I want them to demonstrate a mastery that shows me they know at least 45 of the 50 states. Okay? Maybe I only need to have them do 40 of the 50 states. Maybe 20 of the 50 states. Maybe 50 of the 50 states. But mastery learning requires you to set a threshold. And the students need to know what that is. I had one of the nurses send me something the other day, and she said, this is exactly what I do. Okay? The NCLEX has an 80% pass rate, not 79, not 78, not 79 and a half. Okay? I have to teach my lesson so that the students have or master at least 80% of what I'm teaching them. You can do the same thing in your course. Okay? Notice how the mastery learning model proceeds. We've got 20 students in the class. Okay? And I want them to match states with capitals. And my mastery level is 45 of 50. I teach the lesson on state capitals. It's up to me how I teach it. I might start in the northeast corner of the United States, and we're going to go through Maine and Vermont and New Hampshire and Massachusetts. And then I go to the southeast, and I hit Florida and Georgia and Alabama. And then I hit the Midwest with Ohio and Illinois and Indiana. And then I hit the far west with California. You know, it's up to me how I teach the 50 states and their capitals. That's this instruction part that you see here. Okay, the instruction. And so I might spend the week teaching them all 50 states and their capitals. At the end of the week, I give them a quiz, a test, an exam, call it whatever you want, an assessment. Okay? And I give them a large map of the United States with the names of the states in each of its respective places. And I'd say, here's the list of state capitals. I want you to take every one of those state capitals that is listed and put it in the right state. That's how I'm going to have you demonstrate mastery. Okay, I got 20 students in the class. What happens? Well, I might get 14 of them that have mastered the lesson already. 14 out of the 20 have demonstrated mastery. They have given me 45, 46, 49, 50 of the states correctly. Okay? 14 out of the 20 students. Think about your own class for a second. Okay? I've got a second group of students that fell short. I'm a behavioral teacher now. Okay? They fell short of my 45. Maybe they got 44, maybe they got 22, but they didn't meet my mastery. So what am I going to do? Mastery learning says for those that completed the first time around, they mastered my class, then I'm going to give them something called enrichment activities. I'm going to have them go out and do more. Maybe I'll give them some websites and say, you know what, pick the 5 most interesting states that you find, and tell me what their capital is famous for. Well, if you go to you go to Ohio, and Columbus has this museum and this zoo and this. So I give them enrichment activities. Enrichment activities being something more for them to learn about in this lesson. Okay. I don't say, okay, you already mastered it. Go to the library and read a book. Okay. Or work on your homework in another class. No, I give them predetermined, pre-identified enrichment activities. I take the 6 people that didn't master the first time, and I reteach the lesson. As you might expect, I don't want to teach it the same way I did the first time. I mean, they didn't get it. So I'm going to reteach it differently. Here you go, folks. If you taught it behaviorally the first time, these are probably your cognitive learners and your humanistic learners. So let's try to reteach it using a different approach to this lesson. So rather than listing the 50 states and having them match them up, I might say, look, let's find the states that, I don't know, that are all Republican states. And let's learn about those first. Okay. And then we'll learn about the Democratic states, or we'll learn about the states that were part of the Civil War first. And then we'll learn about the other states that came in to the Union after the Civil War. I'm going to try to teach it differently. Okay. All right. So maybe I'll spend another 2 days doing that. I can't spend another week on it, but, and these times are negotiable. I mean, I'm just throwing these out. And so I teach it again while these guys are off doing something equally important. I can focus on the 6 people that didn't master it the first time, and then I retest them. Okay, let's try it again. Match them up for me. Out of the 6 people that didn't make it the first time, I get 5 of those 6 people, or 4 of those 6 people that can now do 45 out of 50. Pretty good, huh? But I still got 1 or 2 that maybe didn't make it. Well, the mastery learning model stops right there and says, you know what? You got to go on. So I know some people that have read about the mastery model said, well, how many times do I got to go through this? And the answer is, according to the model, the behaviorist, 1 time. Okay? So you don't try to do this over and over and over again. So if you're a behavioral teacher, that's the mastery learning model. And try to think about creating instruction that that moves and is sequenced according to this model. You start with instruction, you give a quiz, you break them out into 2 groups, and off you go. Okay, that's the mastery model. You want to say, well, what does behavioralism look like in the classroom? If I were to walk by and stick my head in, that's what it would look like. I would see you giving your first set of instructions to the entire class, really trying to teach them so that they can successfully meet your criteria. But maybe 2 or 3 days later, I come back and I see you divided into 2 groups. You got 6 of them sitting up front and you're teaching them, and you got the other 14 in the back, and they're doing different kinds of exercises. Okay, so for all the people last week that said you were a mastery learner, there you go. There's your schemata for creating a classroom lesson. I had a lot of cognitivists last week. So let's talk to you guys next. The cognitive model for teaching one of them, not the only one, but a really good one, is called discovery learning. And if you think about that for a second, it has and addresses all of the elements that we talked about last week for the cognitive learner. Okay, I want my prior knowledge. I want to construct new information. I want to have a building block approach. I want to understand based on how my ages and stages where I am. And so discovery learning is going to be your tool, because it will be approached to instruction in which students interact, they explore, they manipulate, they deal with questions, yet give them problems to solve. They perform experiments. Okay, do you see how now it's not behavioral at all, but it is dealing with the way our learners think, the way they construct knowledge, the way they understand things that we're giving them. Okay, students are more likely to understand and remember concepts when they have been part of the discovery process. You know, what's that old saying that they say? Yeah, if you really want to teach me something, if you make me read it, I'll remember 40% of what I read. If you let me view something, I'll remember 60% of what I see. If you have me discover something, if you have me participate, I'll remember 90% of what I do. Okay? And so discovery learning now will help the cognitive learner. Remember, you got to be able to identify this person, the cognitive learner, to understand and remember concepts a lot better, because he or she has been part of the process, part of the exploration, part of the discovery. Teachers have found that discovery learning is most successful when students have prerequisite knowledge. Isn't that what we just said? The students have to have prior knowledge. Okay, so you can't just have them discover something if they haven't been prepared for it. Okay, so you just can't let an engineering student go in the electrical lab and say, you know, see what you can find out about AC versus DC power. Okay, that ain't going to work. They have to have some prerequisite knowledge, and then they have to be given what this is saying here, some structured experiences. You have to guide their discovery. Okay, so this is not the time to sit back, give them a problem, prop your feet up in front of the class and say, take it away, students. We'll see you next week. That doesn't work. Discovery learning is a very solid approach to something. Sometimes we call it the scientific method. Okay? And some of you probably just said, now I know what he's talking about. Okay? Remember the scientific method? Okay? Where you create a theory about something, and then you create a hypothesis. You do some experimenting to test that hypothesis. You evaluate your results, and then you pick the one that works. That's the discovery model. That's the scientific method. You know, I had a group of students one time, and I said, look, you're all Pittsburghers, or at least you live in Pittsburgh right now. You're going from Robert Morris University down to the Civic Arena. You're going to watch a hockey game. It's now the PPG, whatever it is. Okay, so you're going to go watch a hockey game. I want you to lay out the path, the route from Robert Morris University parking lot to the parking lot next to the arena. Okay? There's your theory about how things ought to work. It is, the game starts, maybe we got to do a baseball game. That might be, you're going to go to PNC Park. And the game starts at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Take it away. See what you come up with. And the students start creating hypotheses. Well, we want to go from here down University Boulevard. We're going to get on the Parkway West. We're going to take that through the tunnel. We're going to get off at 279 North, and we're going to get off at the baseball field, and there we are. And then somebody else comes up and says, all right, let's try that. Let's do an experiment on that. Okay? And as they do the experiment, they find out, wait a minute, he just said this is a 4 o'clock start. That means there's going to be traffic on the Parkway. That means we got to add another 20 minutes to our trip at least. It means we're going to have more trouble finding parking once we get downtown. Okay, so the first hypothesis of we'll leave 20 minutes before the game and we'll have our first hot dog before the first pitch throws out doesn't work. So we got to come up with another hypothesis. Well, maybe we'll go across the McKees Rocks Bridge and we'll go down 65, and that way we miss all the Parkway. All right, let's try that. All right, so you test it, you evaluate it, you get the idea where I'm going. So for those of you that like to teach cognitively, this is your model, and it's based on discovery learning. And you can use it for, here's some different ways in which these actually happen now. You can try something like guided discovery. Again, self-guided research projects, very well designed, very well thought out, okay? You're guiding their discovery so that this is not just a hit and miss activity. You can try problem-based learning. I'm going to give you a thought-provoking question, and I want you to come up with an answer for me, okay? Discover it. Go out. Think about it. Not only think about it, not only present me with a solution, but give me your rationale for why you think that will work. Okay? Problem-based learning. Another application of discovery learning is simulation-based learning. And, we've got this RISE Center sitting over in nursing that is the poster child for simulation-based learning. I used to take, and still do, take my technology students, and they give them a wonderful tour. If we're lucky, there's a simulation that's actually going on where somebody's in there and they're trying to talk to the parents or the family of a sick person, or they're doing other very excellent simulation-based learning. And so obviously what you're doing is incorporating real-world problems and letting people go through them. Discovery learning. Okay, it's why we have student teaching and education. It's why we have cooperative co-ops for our graduating seniors. We want to get them into the real world situation. Another application is case-based learning. Think of moot court in law school, where we have taught all of these students about law, textbook law students. They've learned all the textbook stuff. Now it's time to do case-based learning and put that into practice. But you know what? You can do that in your courses too to help your cognitive learners. Okay, I started thinking of one the other day where, we've got all this stuff going on with cybersecurity. Wouldn't it be great to get a group of senior citizens? And these are oftentimes the most vulnerable people when it comes to cybersecurity and cyber attacks. They're the most agreeable. They're the most trusting. But let's give them a case-based scenario where they get a phone call and the phone call person is saying, hey, would you like, a 6-month free subscription to National Geographics? If so, I need your name, I need your phone number, I need your email address, I need your bank account number. Why do you need my bank account number? Okay. Case-based learning. And I guarantee you're probably thinking of several cases now, several things that you teach in your class in which you could put that into practice. I know I do that all the time in my courses. And then finally, there's the category called incidental learning, in which, what do they say? You learn from your mistakes, maybe even better than you learn from being perfect. And that's what this is talking about, giving them an opportunity to discover something in which they are bound to make a mistake. And they're going to learn with immediate feedback from you how to solve real-world problems, how to discover something by dismissing a mistake. Okay. And so create something. And when they gave me their route down the Parkway West through the Fort Pitt Tunnel, I came out immediately and said, there's an accident on the inbound side of the Fort Pitt Tunnel, which happens like every other day. And nobody's getting through the tunnel. What are you going to do? Okay. You made a mistake of assuming that everything was going to be great, or I break down their car for them, or I give them all sorts of ways in which incidental learning comes into play. Okay, so there you go. There's my cognitive people. Let's talk now to my humanists, all right? And your major model for developing humanistic-based learning. And that is a tool called cooperative learning. Aha, that might seem intuitively obvious to you. I'm going to put students into groups. I'm going to have them tasked with doing really suitable group work. I want them to solve a problem, but they can't do it unless they work together. Here are some of the premises for cooperative learning. Things like it's got to be suitable work. It's got to be something that they can actually work on and resolve. It's got to be, you just don't put them into a group and then, like this says here, you put them into a group and hope for the best. No, that doesn't work either. You have to be able to, again, to create the exercise so that they can solve the problem, but still make yourself, what is it called? Right down here at the bottom. There it is. The instructor's role changes for cooperative learning. It's that old saying about you are no longer the sage on the stage. You're now a source of information and a source of knowledge. You become a resource for your students with cooperative learning. Here's some other principles, what's called positive interdependence. What does that mean? Well, that means the students probably can't succeed unless everybody is involved. They're going to depend on other people. And I know for most of us that we've ever tried any cooperative learning exercise like this, you always get students that come up to you and say, look, the group you put me in stinks. And I work better by myself. Just let me do it on my own. And if you're a humanistic teacher, that's not an option. Learning in school has more to do with just content knowledge. If you're going to be an accountant, if you're going to be a journalist, if you're going to be an educator, if you're going to be in, whatever role you're leaving Robert Morris in, you are going to have to work with other people. And so this cooperative learning exercise helps students build the social skills to work together. The greatest example I've got of this, I don't know if any of you have ever had a chance to go down to the Challenger Learning Center at Wheeling Jesuit. It's only about a 45-minute drive. One of the neatest learning centers I've ever seen. And I used to work with them quite a bit. And I remember I used to take some students down there, and we'd go through one of their, what they called an E-mission, which was the poster child again for a cooperative learning exercise. They started, let's say it's a 6th grade class, and their task was to find a spaceship that was lost in one of the outer planets, one of the 5 outer planets. Okay, and we would give them all sorts of information, but every one of the students had a different responsibility. Okay, these 2 students had Mercury, and these 2 students had Jupiter, and these 2 students knew all about Saturn, so that when we gave them exercise inputs, and we say something like, well, the spaceship was 2 days ago, the spaceship passed the 7th planet from the sun, and the people that had Neptune jumped up and said, that's us, we've got Neptune. Nobody had all of the information. So to succeed, everybody had to work together. And we picked one person in the class to be the commander. And it was up to him or her to get all of the information coming from all of the different planets and figure out where the spaceship was. Okay, a really cool exercise. And again, it's something that we can all think about doing in our own classes. Not something for a 5th grade class or a 6th grade class, something appropriate for the academic lesson that we're trying to teach. But the principles are the same. And what was really cool at the end of this course, because we used to invite the parents in too. You can't say anything, parents. You can't even nod to your child. They're up there and they're busy, picking up all this information. But you can watch what they're doing. And I had a mother come up to me at the end of the session, and she just had tears in her eyes. And I said, what's wrong? I said, your kid not do well? Is he upset or what? She said, no, my young son has never been a leader in his class. Nobody, he's got a very small group of friends. This just made him bloom. He stood in front of that group and he shouted to the smarter kids in the class, hey, you might be a smart kid, but I need this information and I need it now. Otherwise, we're going to miss the window. And she just said, I can't tell you what kind of interpersonal and cooperative skills that you just built into my 12-year-old. And that's what the humanistic teacher wants to do, okay? He wants or she wants to create a cooperative learning experience that brings out the elements that we learned last week about humanism, the self-personalization of information, the self-reliance, the interpersonal skills, and so on. There is one piece, though, that a lot of us will forget when we're creating a cooperative learning exercise. And that is, even though the group is ultimately successful or a failure, students still must receive and are individually accountable for their own learning. In other words, you can give a group grade. I've seen some teachers that say everybody in the group's going to get the same grade. No, that's not what cooperative learning says. It says you can give students the same grade for the group portion of cooperative learning, but you must also assign and assess students individually. So there you go. The model for cooperative learning looks something like this. It's got the 4 elements that we just mentioned. The positive interdependence, they all got the work together. The equal participation, they all have to do the same amount of work, okay? The simultaneous interaction, in other words, in your class, you're going to have to give them time to work together. You're going to have to break them out into groups and let them work together. And then there's individual accountability. You do the group grade and you also do the individual grade. Okay, so there we are. There's the introduction to instructional system design and how you can go about designing, redesigning a course or a lesson. It works at either level. We then delved a little bit into one of the key models of each of the 3 schools that we talked about last week. The mastery learning, if you're a behavioral, lets you teach, assess, separate into mastered and non-mastery students, and then help you focus on getting as many of your students to the successful criteria outcome that you initially created when you created the lesson. Okay. Then we talked about discovery learning. And we said, you know what? For those of you that are cognitivists, the discovery learning model and its guided practice, it's many different manifestations of discovery learning, but they all have a couple things in common. They allow the students to go out and explore, to do things on their own, to understand how what they've learned in the past moves them forward in their future learning. And then we wrapped it up by talking about the humanists and the cognitive learning model, the cooperative learning model, in which you have a very specific problem that needs to be solved, and you're going to have the students depend on one another to come to a conclusion. Okay, so that's what I wanted to share with you tonight. As we think about what might happen next week, I'm going to wrap it up by talking about a couple of new theories of teaching. We're going to look at something called the constructivist approach, which is an extension of cognitivism. And then we're going to look at what I think might be the most important thing we do in this series, and that is talk about a new theory called connectivism. Okay? Bring your cell phones next week. Bring your smartphones. Look at your apps. We're going to look at an approach to teaching and learning that a lot of our students that we currently have, especially at the undergrad level, take for granted. Maybe this is how they're going to learn. I don't know. Maybe it's going to affect how we teach once we get through this pandemic. And we found out, we did this just fine at home. We did this just fine with websites.
Can you give a brief?
What's that?
Can you give us a brief of how it's going to be? I'm curious now.
No.
I can't wait for a week now.
No. You gotta hang in there for a couple of days.
Okay, I'll go do some research on my own, some guided learning here.
I can do that, yeah. Okay, so we're going to talk about that, and then we're going to talk about a final concept called differentiated instruction, which and the flipped classroom, which are two things that you might have heard about, maybe you know a lot about, and we can share a little bit about how you can change the instructions that we've looked at to help with students working at various and different levels in your classroom. So let me stop and just see, does anybody have any questions or comments that they'd like to share with the group about what we covered tonight?
I would like to share here my thought. I see myself, I teach introductory course in microeconomics and macroeconomics, and I see myself swinging back and forth between mastery, learning, discovery, and then cooperative. Because at the beginning, students don't have any knowledge. So they cannot, I cannot use discovery learning. For example, if I'm teaching demand and supply, I introduce them to the concept. And then when we change the conditions of the market, I can use discovery learning so that they can find for themselves when they spot the equilibrium, for example, market equilibrium. And then, of course, in more advanced level of teaching, I go to cooperative learning where they can, in a group, apply or offer some projects in one of the fields of economics in general. Is that reasonable reflection on what you, okay.
Absolutely. I mean, it's like my nursing student said, you know what? You're already doing this. Now you can look at what we talked about tonight, maybe get a few more principles that you hadn't thought about that you want to infuse in those, but you're already doing that. And I would guess most of us are. And that's absolutely terrific.
Right.
Next week, when we, one of the most fun classes I've ever had in my entire undergrad career was a class in stock markets, right? Now, this was 40 years ago. But we had to go out and we looked at, I can't remember the name of that book. It had all the stock reports in it. And we had to discover which stocks we wanted to buy. Now they just go onto those computers and they got everything listed there. But the point is, we can think about creating discovery on just about everything. We can do co-op on everything. It doesn't have to be a semester-long exercise. It could be a 1-week exercise, okay? It's just that you're attending to the learning style needs of different groups of students. Good, thank you.
Sure.
Anyone else? Okay, I'm going to turn off the recording, and we're going to make this presentation available.